Hey everybody, my name is Lindsay Jacobs, and today we're here to talk with you all about some voucher bills that have popped up in the South Carolina legislature and the myths that surround those bills. We want to do some myth busting with you. So I'm joined today by Robert Lominack and Fred Jones. They're both going to introduce themselves. I'm going to introduce myself real quick. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director with a 36-year-old public education nonprofit in Greenville called Public Education Partners.
Hey, Lindsay. Hey, Fred. I'm Robert Lominack, the Executive Director of Richland County Public Education Partners, which is not a 36-year-old nonprofit, but we're growing quickly, and we're here in Columbia, South Carolina.
And I'm Fred Jones. I'm the founding principal for Colleton Consulting Group. Again, not around for 36 years. Been around for about 5 years, but I've been in the education policy space for over a decade and have been studying school privatization and school choice for 15 years.
Awesome. Excited to talk with y'all about this today. It's a super important topic. Our agenda is pretty simple. We're going to try to keep this quick because we know people are very busy and sitting down to watch a video. You know, we're usually tucking that in somewhere in the corners of our lives. So we're just going to talk about education scholarship accounts generally, and then we're going to talk about the two specific pieces of voucher legislation that have been introduced in this year's legislative session, so 2021. And then we're just going to do some myth busting, run through some of the common myths that are spoken about this particular type of voucher. And lastly, we're just going to talk about what you can do if this is something you're interested in fighting alongside us and our organizations.
So I'll take this first slide here in terms of the definitions and what we're going to be talking about today. So privatization, and really more so known as school privatization, involves efforts that policymakers go through to design structural programs that essentially take public money and sends them to private schools or private services. And school choice has to do with parents and families exercising their choice to attend a school outside of their neighborhood school or their zone neighborhood school. And so this could mean in the public school system, attending a school that may be a charter school, a county school, a Montessori school, or a magnet school. As it relates to privatization, this could mean a child attending a private school based off of either their own individual finances or through programs that the state may fund.
All right, there are different ways of structuring privatization efforts. And here's some pretty basic definitions to get us started. Traditional vouchers pay for all or part of a student's private school tuition with direct payments from the public treasury. So this would mean a public school student would choose to not attend their zone school, go to a private school, and the state would send money directly to that school to pay for that student's tuition. Education scholarship accounts are public funds that are deposited into a personal account that can be used to pay for a student's private school tuition or other educational expenses such as tutoring, online coursework, transportation, or homeschooling. And this is actually what we're going to be talking about today. And just to be clear, while these are different in in the mechanics of how the money is sent to the private school, there's not a real difference in how they operate, because ultimately the money has to go to a private school or a private service provider, whether it goes directly from the state or passes through a separate private account. It doesn't really make a huge amount of difference in how this affects public education. These education scholarship accounts that we're going to talk about today are the new kid on the block. They were created as a workaround to states' Blaine amendments, which prohibit public funds being used for private schools. And that's obviously been an issue in South Carolina this fall. Right now, ESAs only exist in Florida, Arizona, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Tennessee.
So we thought we might get through this legislative session without an education scholarship account bill proposed, but we've actually seen some version of a voucher and neo voucher bill every year for about the past decade. And we've recently seen these two particular pieces of legislation introduced. So House Bill 3976 and Senate Bill 676, which differ a little bit, but not in any, the cost looks really different. We're going to talk about those, but they're both education scholarship accounts enabling pieces of enabling legislation that would create these, which would basically allow kids to put their money in their backpack and take it with them to a private or religious school in South Carolina. So we can start by talking about the House bill, which was the first bill that was introduced, which is sitting currently in the House Ways and Means Committee and hasn't been scheduled for any sort of hearing. Robert, do you want to talk about eligibility for under the House bill?
So the House bill limits eligibility to students and families at 200% or below the federal poverty level. So for a family of four, that means I think it's around $59,000, almost $60,000 would get up to that 200%. So a family of four earning less than that would be eligible for this education scholarship account.
And how much money are we talking about? I know each piece of legislation has a specific formula, but they basically refer to the average per pupil spending in South Carolina at the state level in our state. And how much does that come out to?
So that's about $6,500 is what the state generally provides per student. So what would happen is under the House bill, they limit it in the first year to 5,000 students. So if 5,000 students took advantage of that bill, it would be 5,000 times $6,500, which is around $32 or $34 million, I think. And then each year they increase the cap. And in year 4, we're up to about 20,000 students, and then it's 130 something million dollars. And then after that, there's no cap. And so it's impossible to predict at this point how much that would cost, but it would obviously be more than 130 something million dollars.
Which is really expensive if you think about the fact that we were speaking about this before. There are over 700,000 public school students in South Carolina. About half of them live in families that are experiencing poverty. So we're talking about over 300,000 students that would likely be eligible to participate in either one of these voucher programs, depending on which piece of legislation passed. So a very hefty price tag is my point.
And I just wanted to make a quick comment/question to both you, Lindsay and Robert. I see that in the Senate bill, special needs students are eligible and specifically called out. I also understand that South Carolina also has a tax credit scholarship for special needs students. So, and tax credit scholarships are also another form of privatization, some would say, as there would be private or select benefits for students with disabilities to go on into private schools. So what do you think that this bill S676 is trying to accomplish if there's somewhat of a school privatization effort already underway that we have in the state?
I think that's a great question. I think just any attempt, I think like if you look at the United States, the tools and the privatizers want a lot of tools in their toolbox. So you're right. In South Carolina, we have a special needs tax credit. It's very popular. I think that they reach capacity every year. And in fact, there's another piece of legislation that's been introduced. I want to say it's House Bill 3899 or some combination of those numbers that would up the eligibility or increase the number of students who are able to participate in the special needs tax credit. So it's interesting that they're pushing for an increase there, but also pushing to include special needs students in the education scholarship account. Or allow them to be able to take part in sort of both vouchers. And I think it's just, again, trying to get kids out of public school and into private school in whatever way they can. It's interesting, a superintendent of special education here in Greenville once told me the amount of money that the public schools are required, because of course, public schools can't turn away any student with special needs. They have to educate them. And we're talking about, especially for students with severe physical disabilities, schools are spending tens of thousands of dollars. And unless you have a lot of money, unless you're a very affluent family, these vouchers are never going to be enough money to cover the cost of providing those services for students with serious special needs. So sometimes I think that these things are included to make these bills more palatable and to seem more generous than they might actually be.
No, thank you for that. That's helpful. And I also see in these two bills that we have up here on the slide have similar covered services, and just in general, ESAs across the country, have a more expansive view of what's eligible. So under vouchers specifically, that's typically public money that's used specifically for tuition or for school vouchers. The public funds goes to tuition, but for ESAs, there's just a more diverse range of options that families can use the money for. It can be tuition and fees, but could also be tutoring, instructional materials, transportation and fees, and other things that are actually such as equipment as well could be allowable uses of funds.
Yeah, and one point about the transportation fees as a covered service, which is interesting because we're going to talk about that being a barrier in just a few minutes. The House bill, it doesn't cover an individual family's cost of getting their child to a school that doesn't provide transportation. It covers the cost for that family to pay a transportation provider. And, I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work in many places, but it's not, you aren't going to be able to be reimbursed for car and mileage that you spend taking your own child to a school outside of, or to a school that doesn't provide transportation.
And you'll see the words "cannot discriminate" are bolded because that's what the legislation articulates, the few protected classes of students against whom can't be discriminated. But what's left out here, and I think this is really important to mention, is students who are members of the LGBTQ community could be excluded from these schools. Students who are Muslim or Hindu trying to get into a Catholic school could be excluded based on their religious beliefs. So those are not protected classes under this bill, and I think that's really important to point out as it relates to these pieces of legislation. They're much more exclusive than the words, school choice and educational freedom might otherwise lead you to believe. And then just lastly, and we can move on to talking about the myths, but both bills have pretty weak accountability mechanisms. There is some testing required, and Robert, you're in a better position to talk about that than I am because I wasn't a teacher. So I don't know if you want to talk about the required testing real quick and then we can move on.
Well, I think, in the past, it's been one of the big complaints about bills like this is that, public schools are very accountable and private schools are not, just by the nature of being private schools. And so this has been an issue in the past, and they seem to be trying to respond to that with this section of the bill that requires some tests, but it doesn't have to be the same test that that student took the year before or that other public school students are taking. So it makes it potentially impossible to figure out two things. One, did that student improve once they shifted from public to a private school? And two, how are they doing compared to their public school peers? And that makes evaluating the results of this, virtually impossible if everybody's taking just random and different tests.
And Robert, in these bills, even if the private school decides to take the same tests as the public schools, do the private schools have to report the results?
I think they have to report at least one result each year, depending on the grade level of the student who shifts into private school. Under the House bill, it's only grades 3 through 8, I think. Once it doesn't appear that there's a testing requirement for high school students that use the education scholarship accounts. And to be honest, I can't remember whether the Senate bill includes a high school test or not.
I also thought it was interesting, and I can't recall which bill it is in, but the test results wouldn't be public until 3 years into the program. So they're required to be testing from the jump, but we as the public and as taxpayers wouldn't be privy to that information until we were 3 years along into spending millions of dollars on the program. And I thought that was really interesting. All right, so let's jump into talking about some of the top myths that folks talk about when that proponents of education scholarships talk about when they're trying to sell their product. So the number one thing is that education scholarship accounts improve educational outcomes for the students who take advantage of them. So the idea is, oh, you're in what they call a failing public school. If you switch over to a private school and we'll help you pay for that, your educational outcomes are going to improve. But the reality is that there's plenty of data that has looked at traditional vouchers because ESAs or education scholarship accounts are kind of new. There isn't a ton of data on them specifically, but because they operate in the exact same way as a voucher, we can look at all the information we have around traditional vouchers, which all that data tells us that at best, there are no gains in academic achievement for the students who take advantage of these vouchers. So that is often the number one selling point, but when you actually dig down into the data and you look at the evidence, you realize that many of those students who were struggling in public schools are also struggling in private schools.
And then the second myth is that ESAs actually save public school districts money, and the rationale behind that myth is that, well, we're shifting that $6,500 that the state would otherwise give to that school district because that student's no longer there. And since you're no longer having to teach that student, you're saving that money because you've got one less student. Here's the reality though, these public school districts and a school in particular has fixed costs that it can't just eliminate because 3 or 6 or 10 or 15 students leave that school. You can't cut a teacher because 6 students leave a school. You can't cut a bus route. You're just not able to reduce the facilities and the staff and the programs and the other similar fixed costs to offset that loss of funding. And in fact, in a prior year, when the State Fiscal Affairs Office examined the cost savings of a similar education scholarship account bill, what it found was there was not going to be any savings at all, really. And so I think the state itself has acknowledged that this is not a way to save any money. You're just going to take money out of a public school, and that district will get less money than it otherwise would have gotten with the exact same costs. All right, third myth. ESAs provide all students with educational choice. So this is one of the most powerful myths because, we all want some agency and some ability to, determine our own paths and our children's paths. And so I think this one is something that people really grab onto, but the reality is this isn't choice for everyone. This is really choice for a few, because in many counties, there might be, 2 or fewer, one private school, and it might not be a private school who will accept, your child for the reasons we talked about a minute ago. And some counties have no private schools, but more importantly, transportation, food access, steep tuition costs, and disability really remain barriers to many families, especially those who are living at the poverty level. Private schools most often are not going to provide transportation. So if a family does not have their own car and their own ability to get their child to that school, then this is not a choice. Our public schools feed students 2 and sometimes 3 meals a day. So if this is a family that cannot afford that additional cost for their student, then this is not really a choice. And also, this is providing $6,500. There are plenty of private schools that cost $20,000 or more a year. And this is just not going to help students attend schools that cost more than that amount when these families are not going to be able to cover that cost. But not only just the tuition costs, a lot of these private schools will also have additional fees and book expenses and things like that add on and become insurmountable barriers for some of our families living in poverty.
And then I would also just like to add a little bit more about just the myth that ESAs provide all students with educational choice. At least if you look at the school districts or the counties with our largest metropolitan areas, such as Charleston, Greenville, and Columbia, as I mentioned before, that these counties, at least in some form, already have some form of at least public school choice. Students are not mandated to go to their neighborhood school. If there are charter schools, students are eligible to apply. If they're magnet schools, if they're Montessori schools, if there's just other county schools. And then there's some legal parameters around the ESSA or ESEA, where if a student is attending a failing school, they can go to a different school within their county. So they're not forced, families are not forced to go to their neighborhood school. There are other public school options, and ESAs themselves don't on its own provide more students with choice. There are choice that already exists within the public school system.
And it's just so interesting that that public school choice is not choice that we're interested in investing in, that our decision makers are interested in investing in. They'd rather create a parallel system of education, which I think is important to note. If we were really interested in improving educational outcomes for all students, well, the vast majority of our students currently go to and will always go to traditional public schools. And so improving outcomes for them there is of paramount importance.
Yeah, so I'll take this one. The myth is ESAs are transparent and accountable as public schools, but the reality is they are not. In order for a public school to receive public funds, they enter somewhat of a contractual arrangement with the state and the federal government. Public schools have to go through certain requirements, such as reporting school report cards, going through the accountability system. They have to administer certain assessments, such as the South Carolina Ready Assessment. So these are things that they have to go through each year. And it's critical because as a taxpayer, I want to know and I want to ensure that the school that I may send my child to is accredited. I want to know the number of certified teachers. I want to know the suspension and expulsion rate. And I want to know how effective that public school has been academically with reliable tests that are linked to college and career ready standards. And so those are all things the public school system is obligated to do. In the private school system, the private schools, by essence of being private, do not have to do that. They can run and operate their school in the way that they see fit. However, I think the challenge is when a private school receives, whether it's vouchers or ESAs, it becomes a point where if they're not obligated to the same reporting and accountability and transparency requirements, it's an issue sometimes of really a fairness. And so public schools are receiving public money and have public accountability and transparency. Then you have private schools, if they're receiving ESAs, indoor vouchers, or other forms of school privatization, they do not have the same transparency and accountability requirements, but they're receiving the public money. And what we've seen, at least in other states, there's been instances in which literally there would be people who would go open up private schools so that they can go recruit eligible students to come to their school, because they know that those students in the school itself don't have to report. One, if they have to report at all, sometimes they don't have to report anything, or what they're reporting is not similar to what the public schools are reporting. So if it's a nationally normed test, instead of a very specific state test that the public school system has to conduct, they're not the same test. So there's no way to ever compare how students are doing at private school compared to a similar situated school or student would perform at a public school. So those are some of the issues that I think are taking place. I also think in terms of an accountability issue that we must, like, as a taxpayer, I want to know how well students are doing and how far my dollars are going. And Lindsay, you referred to this earlier. If if it's 3 years before I even know the performance of the individuals taking advantage of this system is doing, then there's a pure lack of transparency that's going on that is just not fair when each and every year the public school system has to go through and has to do those things. So just wanted to mention that in terms of that myth.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And I mean, it's really simple, right? You can't compare oranges and apples. And so, how can you, if we're going back to that first myth, which is ESAs improve educational outcomes, well, how could you ever demonstrate that if you're not using the same measurements that public schools are using? So, in some ways, you could skew the data to say anything you want because you aren't reporting your outcomes in the same way that public schools are reporting them. And like you said, it's just in many ways an issue of inherent fairness. Is it fair that both providers are receiving public dollars, but one is held to a much higher standard of accountability and transparency than the other? So thanks, Fred.
And the other thing that I forgot to mention, that there's a financial component to this as well. So, I mean, it could encourage fraud, abuse, and neglect to some extent.
And there are demonstrated instances of that. I mean, Arizona, the states that have longstanding voucher programs, all you have to do is Google voucher fraud Arizona, and you'll see news articles about parents spending money on things that they ought not be spending money on, and all sorts of scandals. So there have been a lot of documented instances of abuse of vouchers in the past. So this myth is often folks say parents should have choice, they should have agency, which of course they should, and that in a free market system, they're not going to send their children to schools that aren't successful. And you're probably thinking, yeah, of course parents aren't going to send their kids to schools that aren't successful if they can choose otherwise. But the reality is that there was a study, I believe, out of New York that showed that the vast majority, up to 97% of families that had children in so-called failing schools, chose to leave their children in those schools, even when they had a legal right to remove their child from that school and send them somewhere else. And then I can give you a very specific example in South Carolina where recently, or in recent history rather, we had charter schools that were performing quite terribly, that were chartered out of the South Carolina out of the public charter school district. So rather than coming into compliance, which is what they were required to do under that charter, a loophole in existing state law was exploited to create a different charter authorizer. And so those schools still exist today. They're still performing terribly, and parents are still sending their children there. So, and again, this is public information because our charter schools in South Carolina are public. So that's an example of it's very difficult to uproot your child, to uproot your family, and move your child to a different school, even when that school may not be up to snuff. So there are documented instances of parents leaving their children in schools that aren't serving them, even in a free market system where they have a right or an opportunity to remove their child and send them somewhere else.
So just wanted to talk about vouchers being the best solution for vulnerable students. I think that it's been well documented that in many instances, vouchers and ESAs, where there is data, have shown that this is just really not the case. The reality is the fact that in many instances, in order to participate in these programs, students have to give up their civil rights and different protections under a student's civil rights. So Lindsay spoke about the different items of which the new South Carolina ESA bill can't discriminate based off race and class and other things. But there's been documented instances, at least in other states, where there would be private schools that wouldn't allow students who had certain hairstyles to come to school and or be admitted, whether that's um, locking your hair, having braids, indoor cornrows, which are traditional hairstyles in the African American community. She also spoke about the LGBTQ folks who can be discriminated under this bill, and then additionally, other religious folks and who may not be Christians could be discriminated against. And then lastly, students with disabilities could potentially not receive all of the services that they could have if they were enrolled in a public school. So these are some of the realities that are actually taking place as well. Vouchers don't inherently, or ESAs don't inherently provide more services. In many instances, they will receive less services and or students may be discriminated against. And I think what we also haven't said in this conversation as well is we're talking about the delivery mechanism of education. So who does it? So whether it's the public school system or the private school system. And as referenced earlier, all the research says at best is neutral academic outcomes, but in many instances, it's actually the private schools end up performing worse than the public school system, controlling for the student and the family that they come from. So I think it's important that in this debate that we should actually be talking about the investments in what we know are school improvement models, such as extended learning time, PD to the parent and or the teachers, and other mechanisms that we know are linked to research to improve outcomes versus investing in mechanisms of delivery that we know just do not work. So I just kind of wanted to also add that to the conversation as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Fred, that a lot of these students, I think in many ways, one way to sell this product or the way in which the private school proponents are selling this product is to say that this is a great alternative for students who are vulnerable. So whether that's Black and brown students or poor students or LGBT, not in South Carolina, less so LGBTQ students, since our state doesn't seem super interested in protecting that particular group of students. But it's interesting, you know, many students who, for example, are experiencing poverty also experience the trauma related to growing up experiencing poverty. And so rather than investing, again, the overwhelming majority of those children will always be in public schools, and they require certain interventions and certain supports that we have not done we have not invested in a widespread way. And so it's really frustrating to sell a product that's not rooted in that evidence, that data-based, in any sort of evidence or data, rather than investing in the things that we know that have been proven across the board to improve outcomes for students who are vulnerable, particularly Black and brown students, poor students, students with disabilities. So it's unfortunate that that's the way in which this program is marketed. And there is definitely a better way to spend, in my opinion, and I'm sure the two of you agree, definitely a better way to spend tens or potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in South Carolina to invest in vulnerable children.
Yeah, you made a good point that I wanted to just emphasize, and that is that, you know, the effects of poverty and trauma, if unaddressed, will follow the student no matter what school they go to. And if we invested in addressing those effects, or at least mitigating them, I think that's where we would see real results. But if we just create this, what you call it, a parallel system, and send these kids to that system where there is less transparency and less accountability, all we're doing then is hiding the problem and becoming purposely ignorant of the results by not requiring the same accountability and transparency that we require of the public schools.
Yeah, thank you both. Before we go, so our contact information is on this slide. All three of us are happy to talk with anybody about vouchers to dig into this more. There's obviously so much we could say and so much time we could fill. Before we jump, I wonder if each one of us could just share a way that we recommend folks get involved if they're interested in fighting this privatization effort in South Carolina and standing up for our public schools. Robert, just because your face was the first face I saw, I'm going to start with you.
You know, I think folks who have kids in public schools have access to their school improvement councils at their schools. They have access to their PTOs or PTAs. I think, you know, see if you can talk to them and start generating some interest about this topic so that you can educate more people. You know, show this video or something similar at your next meeting and see if you can start getting folks energized around this issue to build momentum for some opposition to these two bills.
And I would say I would contact your local or your state leaders and just ask them what evidence that they have that shows that this, by investing tens of millions of dollars in the ESAs, our students would be better off. And just ask them what evidence that they have. And if they don't have any evidence, ask them to get some, ask them to study it, ask them for the information before our taxpayer dollars essentially go to that. And I just have a little one in the background.
Yeah, I echo both what Robert and Fred said, and I think Fred's right. Establish a relationship with your elected officials. They're humans. They are, for the most part, in my experience, really accessible. So shoot them an email or give them a phone call and say, hey, I'd love to sit down and talk with you about why public schools are important to me and the ways in which I think you could invest in public schools rather than divesting and sending money to a parallel system of education. And there are plenty of organizations you can reach out to. Robert's organization, my organization, our websites are up. Again, Fred is a wonderful resource here in South Carolina. I also recommend you check out the Southern Education Foundation, Public Funds for Public Schools, and the Education Law Center. All three of those groups are always talking about vouchers, fighting the good fight, and have tons of excellent resources on their website. And if you can't find them, just shoot us an email and we'll send them along to you. So thanks for watching this video and share it with as many people as you possibly can, just to maybe lay a foundation for why vouchers are harmful for South Carolina and our public schools. I think that's it. Thanks so much.
Good talking to y'all.
Good talking to you too. Thank you.